The monitors flickered at exactly 3:16 and 58 seconds, and Julian knew it was happening again. He'd been working night security at Harrowfield Research Institute for 8 months now. 8 months of empty hallways, humming fluorescents, and the kind of silence that made his ears ring. But for the past 3 weeks, something had been wrong with the surveillance system. Every single night, at precisely 3:17 a.m., the cameras showed corridors that didn't exist. Julian leaned forward in his chair, fingers hovering over the keyboard. The timestamp in the corner read 3:16 and 59 seconds. His coffee had gone cold hours ago, but his hands were steady. He'd learned to be ready for this moment. 3:17 and 0 seconds. Monitor 7 switched feeds. Instead of the familiar view of corridor C4, the screen now displayed a hallway Julian had never seen before. The walls were the same institutional beige as the rest of Harrowfield, but the layout was impossible. The corridor stretched further than the building's blueprints allowed, disappearing into shadows that seemed too deep for the overhead lighting. Julian reached for his radio, then stopped. He'd tried reporting this before. The day shift supervisor, Martinez, had reviewed the recordings and found nothing unusual. The timestamp showed normal corridor footage, nothing more, but Julian saw what he saw. The impossible hallway on Monitor 7 was longer tonight. Last week, it had extended maybe 30 feet before the darkness swallowed it. Tonight, he could see at least 50 feet, maybe 60, and there were doors along the walls. Doors that opened into rooms that couldn't exist in the real building. He pulled up the building schematics on his tablet. Corridor C4 ran along the eastern wall of the research wing. Beyond that wall was the parking lot. There was no space for the extended hallway he was seeing. No space for those additional rooms. A soft beeping from the motion sensors made him look up. Zone 7, Corridor C4. Julian's chest tightened. He checked Monitor 7 again. The impossible hallway was still there, stretching into darkness. But according to the motion sensors, something was moving through the real Corridor C4. He switched to Monitor 6, which covered the actual entrance to C4, empty. Then Monitor 8, which showed the other end, also empty. But Zone 7 was still showing motion. Julian stood up, his chair rolling backward with a soft squeak that seemed too loud in the silence. He grabbed his flashlight and clipped the radio to his belt. The elevator was too noisy for this time of night, so he took the stairs, moving quietly through the emergency stairwell. The second floor smelled like disinfectant and that particular staleness that came from recycled air. Julian's footsteps echoed despite his attempts at stealth. When he reached Corridor C4, he paused at the entrance, listening. Nothing. He stepped into the hallway and immediately felt the wrongness. The air was colder here, and it carried a scent he couldn't identify, something like ozone, but heavier, more organic. Julian walked slowly down the corridor, checking each door as he passed. Storage closets, small offices, a supply room, all locked, all exactly where they should be according to the blueprints. But the feeling of wrongness intensified with each step. Halfway down the corridor, he stopped. There was something different about the wall on his right. The paint looked newer, cleaner, and there was a draft coming from somewhere it shouldn't be. He pressed his hand against the wall. It felt solid enough, but the draft was definitely coming from behind it. Julian ran his fingers along the edge where the wall met the ceiling, searching for gaps. Nothing visible, but the air movement was unmistakable. His radio crackled to life, making him jump. Dr. Walsh's voice, tired and irritated. "Julian, you there?" Julian fumbled for the radio. "Yes, Dr. Walsh. Is everything all right? I'm in Lab 7. Motion sensors are going crazy up here. You seeing anything on the cameras?" Julian looked at his watch. 3:29 a.m. He'd been away from the security desk for 12 minutes. "I'll check the monitors and get back to you." He hurried back to the stairwell, taking the steps 2 at a time. When he reached the security office, all the monitors showed normal corridor views. Monitor 7 displayed the real C4, empty and properly lit. No sign of the impossible hallway. Julian checked the recorded footage, rewinding to 3:17 a.m. The timestamp showed exactly what Martinez would see later, normal corridor footage. Nothing unusual, but Julian remembered what he'd seen. The extended hallway, the extra doors. the darkness that stretched beyond the building's physical boundaries. He radioed Dr. Walsh. "Everything looks normal on the cameras. Might have been a system glitch." "Roger that. These sensors have been acting up all week." Dr. Walsh's voice carried a note of exhaustion that Julian recognized. The researcher had been staying late more often recently, working on whatever classified project had taken over Lab 7. Julian settled back into his chair and made a note in the security log. 3:17 a.m. minor camera malfunction on monitor 7, resolved automatically. Motion sensors triggered in Zone 7, no visual confirmation of activity. The rest of his shift passed without incident, but Julian couldn't shake the memory of that extended corridor. When daylight began filtering through the lobby windows, he felt the familiar relief that came with sunrise. Whatever was happening at 3:17 a.m. seemed confined to the deep night hours. Martinez arrived at 7:45, earlier than usual. He looked tired, older somehow. "Everything quiet last night?" Martinez asked, settling into his chair with a heavy sigh. "Pretty much. That camera glitch happened again on monitor 7. Martinez's expression tightened almost imperceptibly. Same time, 3:17 a.m., on the dot. Martinez was quiet for a long moment, staring at the bank of monitors. When he spoke, his voice was carefully neutral. "Julian, I need to ask you something, and I want you to think carefully before you answer. What exactly are you seeing on monitor 7? Julian hesitated. He'd been reporting the malfunctions as technical glitches, not wanting to sound paranoid or unstable. But something in Martinez's tone suggested this conversation was more important than he'd realized. "It's hard to describe. The camera seems to show corridor C4, but extended. Like there's more hallway than there should be. How much more? Tonight it looked like maybe 60 feet, with doors along the walls." Martinez nodded slowly, as if this confirmed something he'd already suspected. "Julian, I'm going to share something with you, and it doesn't leave this room. We've been getting reports about corridor anomalies for the past month, not just from night security, but from researchers working late. People are seeing spaces that don't match the building plans." The weight in Julian's chest shifted, becoming something closer to dread. "What kind of reports?" Dr. Walsh mentioned finding an unlocked office that wasn't on her floor plan. Dr. Foster swears he walked through a storage room that was twice the size it should have been. And yesterday, maintenance found a ventilation duct that leads to a space that shouldn't exist. Martinez pulled up a file on his computer and turned the screen toward Julian. It showed architectural blueprints of Harrowfield's second floor, but these weren't the plans Julian had been using for reference. These blueprints showed additional rooms, extended corridors, and spaces that Julian was certain hadn't existed yesterday. "These are the updated schematics," Martinez said. "They were submitted by the architectural firm last week. They claim these are the original plans from when the building was constructed." Julian studied the blueprints. According to these plans, corridor C4 extended exactly as far as he'd been seeing on monitor 7. The additional rooms were marked as storage spaces and small research labs. But these plans show spaces that extend beyond the eastern wall. They would overlap with the parking lot. That's what we thought too. So we sent a team to check the parking lot boundaries. "Julian, the parking lot is 15 feet further east than our previous surveys indicated. The additional space has always been there." The wrongness Julian had been feeling crystallized into genuine fear. He looked at the architectural plans again, noting details he'd missed before. Room numbers that didn't follow the building's numbering system. Corridor designations that included letters not used elsewhere in the facility. "How is that possible?" Martinez closed the file and leaned back in his chair. "We don't know, but we think the 3:17 a.m. phenomena might be connected to whatever's happening with the building's spatial dimensions." The fluorescent lights above them flickered briefly, and Julian felt that familiar draft he'd noticed in corridor C4. But now he was 2 floors away from that hallway. "Martinez, there's something else. When I went to check C4 last night, I could feel air movement through the wall, like there was open space behind it." Martinez was quiet for a long moment, staring at the monitors. When he spoke, his voice carried a weight Julian hadn't heard before. There's a protocol in place for this situation. It's called the 317 protocol. If the spatial anomalies continue to expand, we might need to evacuate certain sections of the building. Evacuate? Why? Because we don't know where these additional spaces are coming from or where they led, and we don't know what might be using them. The draft Julian had noticed seemed to grow stronger, carrying that strange ozone scent. He looked at the monitors, checking each corridor view carefully. Everything appeared normal, but he found himself studying the edges of each frame, looking for signs of spaces that shouldn't exist. Martinez stood up and walked to the window that overlooked the parking lot. The morning sunlight cast sharp shadows between the cars, and Julian could see the maintenance crew setting up orange cones around an area near the eastern wall of the building. "They're doing ground-penetrating radar today," Martinez said, trying to map whatever's underneath the parking lot. Julian joined him at the window. From this angle, the building looked exactly as it always had. Solid, institutional, unremarkable. But he knew that appearance was deceiving. "Martinez, what exactly is Harrowfield researching? I mean, what's the classified project Dr. Walsh is working on?" Martinez was quiet for so long that Julian thought he wasn't going to answer. When he finally spoke, his voice was barely above a whisper. "Spatial engineering. They're trying to create artificial dimensional spaces, rooms that exist independently of normal three-dimensional geometry." The words hung in the air between them, carrying implications that Julian didn't want to consider. He thought about the impossible hallway he'd been seeing, the extended corridor that stretched beyond the building's physical boundaries. "Are you saying they succeeded?" "I'm saying we don't know what they accomplished. The project was suspended 3 weeks ago after some kind of containment failure, but the spatial anomalies started the next day." Julian looked at the architectural plans still displayed on Martinez's computer screen. The additional rooms and extended corridors suddenly took on a different significance. These weren't spaces that had always existed and been forgotten. They were spaces that had been created, and now they were expanding. The radio crackled. "Martinez, this is Dr. Walsh. I need you to come to Lab 7 immediately. We've got a situation." Martinez grabbed his keys and headed for the door. "Julian, monitor the cameras. If anything happens at 3:17 tonight, I want a complete recording of every angle." After Martinez left, Julian sat alone in the security office, staring at the bank of monitors. The corridors looked normal, familiar, safe. But he knew that was an illusion. At 3:17 a.m., the building would show its true nature again. The impossible spaces would return, bringing with them questions he wasn't sure he wanted answered. He pulled up the overnight security logs, looking for patterns he might have missed. The first report of spatial anomalies was dated 3 weeks and 2 days ago. A researcher named Dr. Foster had reported finding an unlocked door that led to a storage room not shown on any building plans. The room had been empty, except for a single chair facing the wall. 2 days later, Dr. Walsh reported discovering an office that contained furniture covered in dust, as if it had been abandoned for years. The office wasn't on any floor plan, and when she returned the next day with building maintenance, they couldn't find it again. The reports became more frequent after that. Ventilation ducts that led to spaces too large for the building's infrastructure. Stairwells that had an extra landing not shown in the architectural plans. Corridors that seemed longer during certain hours of the night. And always, the phenomena peaked at 3:17 a.m. Julian made copies of all the reports and stored them on a secure drive. Whatever was happening at Harrowfield went beyond simple technical malfunctions or measurement errors. The building was changing, growing, developing spaces that existed in defiance of normal physics. When his shift ended at 8 a.m., Julian didn't go home immediately. Instead, he walked around the exterior of the building, studying its proportions and looking for signs of the spatial expansion Martinez had mentioned. The eastern wall looked normal from the outside, but when Julian paced off the distance from the wall to the parking lot boundary, he found himself confused. His measurements didn't match what he remembered from previous walks around the building. A maintenance worker approached him, carrying a clipboard and looking harried. "You're Julian, right? Night security." "That's right. I'm Tom, from facilities." Listen, I need to ask you something weird. Have you noticed anything unusual about the building's dimensions lately? Julian felt a chill that had nothing to do with the morning air. What kind of unusual? Tom gestured toward the eastern wall. We're doing structural surveys today, and our measurements don't match the original construction documents. The building is approximately 15 feet wider than it should be. When did you first notice the discrepancy? That's the thing. We measure this building every year for insurance purposes. Last year's measurements matched the construction docs perfectly, but when we measured yesterday, we found the additional width. Julian looked at the eastern wall again, trying to see whatever change had occurred. The building looked the same as it always had, but he was beginning to understand that appearance meant very little in this context. Tom, have you been inside the areas that correspond to the additional width? Yeah, that's corridor C4 and the rooms adjacent to it. Everything looks normal from the inside, but according to our external measurements, those spaces shouldn't fit in the building. Julian thanked Tom and headed to his car, but he couldn't shake the feeling that he was missing something important. The spatial anomalies weren't random. They followed a pattern, clustering around specific areas and times, and they were expanding. That night, Julian arrived at work 30 minutes early. He wanted to review the camera feeds from the previous 3:17 a.m. incident, looking for details he might have missed. The recording showed exactly what he remembered: Monitor 7 displaying an impossible view of an extended corridor. But when he slowed the playback and watched frame by frame, he noticed something new. At 3:17 and 3 seconds, for exactly 2 frames, a shadow moved across the extended hallway. Something had been in that impossible space. Julian enhanced the image as much as the system would allow, but the shadow was too indistinct to identify. It could have been a person, or equipment, or something else entirely. But it had been moving with purpose, following the corridor toward the areas of deepest shadow. He made a note to discuss this with Martinez in the morning, then settled in to wait for the night's 3:17 a.m. event. At 2:45 a.m., Julian began experiencing the familiar sensations that preceded the spatial anomaly. The air grew colder, carrying that strange ozone scent. The building's ambient sounds changed subtly, as if the acoustic properties of the space were shifting. At 3:10 a.m., he felt the draft he'd come to associate with the impossible spaces. It seemed to come from the walls themselves, as if the building was breathing. At 3:16 and 50 seconds, Julian positioned himself in front of Monitor 7, ready to record whatever appeared. 3:17 and 0 seconds. The screen flickered, and the impossible corridor appeared, longer than ever before. Julian could see at least 80 feet of extended hallway, with multiple side passages branching off in directions that should have led outside the building. And this time, he could see light coming from some of the additional rooms. Julian grabbed his radio and called Martinez, even though the day supervisor wouldn't arrive for hours. Martinez, if you're monitoring the emergency channel, you need to see this. The spatial anomaly is more extensive tonight. Static answered him, but then Martinez's voice came through, groggy but alert. I'm here, Julian. What are you seeing? The extended corridor is longer than before, maybe 80 feet, and there are lights on in some of the side rooms. Martinez was quiet for a moment. Julian, I need you to do something that might sound dangerous, but it's important. I want you to go to corridor C4 and try to access the extended space. Are you sure that's safe? We've run out of safe options. The spatial expansion is accelerating. If we don't understand what's happening soon, the anomalies might become permanent. Julian grabbed his flashlight and headed for the stairs, keeping his radio open so Martinez could hear what was happening. When he reached corridor C4, the wrongness was stronger than ever. The air was noticeably colder, and the draft coming through the wall had become a gentle but persistent breeze. Martinez, the air movement is much stronger tonight. It feels like there's an open door behind the wall. Julian pressed his hand against the wall where he'd felt the draft before. This time, instead of solid drywall, his hand encountered empty space. The wall was gone. Where the solid wall had been the night before, Julian now saw an opening into the extended corridor he'd been viewing on Monitor 7. The impossibly long hallway stretched ahead of him, lit by fluorescent fixtures that cast the same institutional lighting as the rest of Harrowfield. Martinez, I can see into the extended space. There's an opening where the wall used to be. Static crackled over the radio, and Martinez's voice was strained. Julian, I need you to be very careful. Document everything you see, but don't go too far into the extended area. Julian stepped through the opening, feeling the temperature drop another 10 degrees. The extended corridor was identical to the normal hallway in terms of construction and materials, but the proportions were subtly wrong. The ceiling seemed higher, the walls more widely spaced. He walked slowly down the impossible hallway, checking the rooms that branched off from it. Most were empty, furnished with basic institutional furniture covered in a fine layer of dust. But some contained equipment he didn't recognize, devices that hummed softly in the artificial silence. Martinez, there are rooms here with equipment I've never seen before. Some kind of research apparatus. Julian entered one of the lit rooms and found a desk covered with documents. The papers were technical specifications for something called Project Doorway, dated 6 months ago. According to the documents, Harrowfield had been attempting to create stable dimensional pockets for expanded storage and research space. The project had apparently succeeded beyond anyone's expectations. Martinez, I found documentation for something called Project Doorway. It looks like they were intentionally creating these additional spaces. Julian photographed the documents with his phone, but when he checked the images, they showed only blank paper. Whatever process had created these spaces seemed to resist normal documentation. As he moved deeper into the extended area, Julian noticed that the rooms were becoming less institutional and more residential. He found spaces furnished like apartments, complete with kitchens and bathrooms. Some showed signs of recent habitation. Martinez, some of these rooms look like people have been living in them. That's impossible. No one has clearance to access the extended areas. Julian checked one of the apparently inhabited rooms more carefully. The bed was unmade, clothes hung in the closet, and there were personal items on the nightstand. But everything was covered with the same fine dust he'd seen elsewhere. It looked like someone had been living here, but had left suddenly, or had been forced to leave. Julian's radio crackled with static, and Martinez's voice came through distorted and broken. Julian, getting interference. Need you to? Back. The static grew worse, and Julian realized he was losing communication the deeper he went into the extended space. He turned around, intending to head back to the original corridor, but found himself disoriented. The hallway behind him stretched in both directions, identical and seemingly endless. He couldn't tell which way led back to the normal building. Julian tried to retrace his steps, but the corridor seemed to have changed while he wasn't looking. Doors that had been on his left were now on his right. Rooms he'd explored were no longer where he'd left them. He was lost in an impossible space that existed within the walls of Harrowfield Research Institute. Julian forced himself to stay calm and think systematically. He pulled out his phone to check the time, but the display showed only static. His flashlight still worked, but the beam seemed weaker than it should have been. Moving slowly and deliberately, Julian tried each door he passed, looking for any landmark that might help him navigate back to the real building. Most rooms were empty or contained unfamiliar equipment, but eventually he found one that looked different. This room contained a single chair facing a wall covered with equations and diagrams. The mathematical formulas were beyond Julian's understanding, but he recognized some of the spatial relationships. They seemed to describe methods for folding space, creating pockets of extended dimension within normal three-dimensional geometry. At the bottom of the wall, in different handwriting, someone had written, "The spaces remember what we put in them." Julian felt a chill that had nothing to do with the temperature. He photographed the wall with his phone, and this time the image appeared normally. Whatever was preventing documentation in other areas didn't apply here. As he studied the equations, Julian began to understand the scope of what Harrowfield had accomplished. They hadn't just created additional storage space. They had developed a method for expanding the interior dimensions of any structure without affecting its external appearance. But something had gone wrong. The expanded spaces were growing beyond their intended boundaries, developing characteristics that hadn't been programmed into them. They were becoming autonomous. Julian heard footsteps in the corridor outside the equation room. Slow, deliberate steps that echoed strangely in the extended space. He moved to the doorway and looked out, but saw no one. The footsteps continued, moving away from his position. Julian followed the sound, hoping it might lead him back to the normal building. But as he walked, he realized the footsteps were keeping pace with him, always just far enough ahead to remain out of sight. "Hello," Julian called out. "Is someone there?" The footsteps stopped immediately. Julian waited, listening carefully. After a few moments, the footsteps resumed, but now they seemed to be coming from behind him. He turned around and saw a figure at the far end of the corridor. Too distant to make out details, but definitely human in shape. The figure raised what might have been a hand in greeting, then turned and walked away. Julian hurried after the figure, but when he reached the spot where it had been standing, he found only an empty corridor stretching in both directions. But there was something new. A door he hadn't seen before, marked with a simple placard, "Exit." Julian approached the door cautiously. It looked exactly like the other doors in the extended space, but there was something different about it. The air around it felt warmer, more normal. He tried the handle and found it unlocked. The door opened into corridor C4 of the normal building, exactly where he'd entered the extended space hours earlier. Julian stepped through and immediately felt the familiar sensation of normal dimensional space. The air was warmer, the proportions correct, the sense of wrongness gone. He looked at his watch. 6:45 a.m. He'd been in the extended space for over 3 hours, but it had felt like minutes. Julian turned around to look at the opening he'd just come through, but found only solid wall. The entrance to the extended space had vanished as completely as if it had never existed. His radio crackled to life. "Julian, respond immediately. Where are you?" Martinez's voice carried a note of panic that Julian had never heard before. "I'm in corridor C4. I'm fine. What's wrong?" "Julian, you've been missing for over 3 hours. We've had search teams throughout the building looking for you." Julian looked at his watch again. 6:45 a.m. The timing matched what Martinez was telling him, but Julian's subjective experience of the extended space had been much shorter. "I found the entrance to the extended areas. There are rooms in there, Martinez, inhabited rooms, and equations that explain how the dimensional expansion works." Martinez was quiet for a long moment. "Julian, I need you to come to the security office immediately. We have a situation." When Julian reached the security office, he found Martinez waiting with 2 people he didn't recognize. A woman in a business suit and a man in what looked like military fatigues. "Julian, this is Dr. Sarah Mitchell from the Department of Spatial Sciences and Colonel Harrison from Special Projects Division." Dr. Mitchell stepped forward with a tablet in her hand. "Mr. Julian, we need to debrief you immediately about your experience in the extended dimensional space. But first, I need to ask you some questions about your current physical condition." She ran some kind of handheld scanner over Julian's body, frowning at the readout. "Dr. Mitchell, what exactly are you scanning for?" "Dimensional displacement markers. When someone spends time in artificially created space, their molecular structure retains traces of the experience." The scanner beeped, and Dr. Mitchell's expression grew more concerned. "Mr. Julian, according to this reading, you've been exposed to severe dimensional fluctuation, more than should be possible from a brief visit to the extended areas." Julian felt the first stirring of real alarm. "What does that mean?" Colonel Harrison answered. "It means you may have been in that space much longer than you realize. Time moves differently in artificially created dimensions." Dr. Mitchell consulted her tablet again. "The quantum signature suggests approximately 72 hours of exposure." Julian stared at her. "That's impossible. I was only in there for a few minutes, maybe an hour at most." Dr. Mitchell and Colonel Harrison exchanged a look that Julian didn't like. "Mr. Julian," Dr. Mitchell said carefully, "what's the last thing you remember clearly from before entering the extended space?" Julian thought back. Working his normal shift. Watching Monitor 7 at 3:17 a.m. The conversation with Martinez about the spatial anomalies. but as he tried to recall specific details, he realized his memories were fragmented. There were gaps, periods where he couldn't account for his actions or whereabouts. "I'm not sure," he admitted. "Some of it's unclear." Colonel Harrison leaned forward. "Mr. Julian, we believe you may have been in the extended dimensional space for much longer than you realize. During that time, you may have encountered things that your conscious mind has chosen not to remember." "What kind of things?" Dr. Mitchell pulled up a file on her tablet and showed Julian a photograph. It showed the equation room he'd discovered, but in this image, the walls were covered with additional writing. Mathematical formulas, but also what looked like personal notes. "Do you recognize any of this writing?" Julian studied the photograph. Some of the equations looked familiar from his visit to the room, but there were sections of handwriting he didn't remember seeing. And some of the handwriting looked like his own. "That's not possible. I've never written equations like that." Dr. Mitchell showed him another photograph, this one of a room Julian didn't remember visiting. It looked like a makeshift laboratory, with equipment arranged on tables and whiteboards covered with diagrams. In the center of the room was a chair. Sitting in the chair was Julian himself, apparently unconscious or asleep. The photograph was time-stamped 48 hours earlier. Julian felt the world tilt around him. He studied the image carefully, looking for signs that it had been manipulated, but everything appeared authentic. "I don't remember any of this." Colonel Harrison closed the tablet. "Mr. Julian, we believe you've been experiencing temporal displacement while in the extended dimensional space. Your conscious mind returns to normal time, but your body continues to exist in the extended areas. You're saying I've been in two places at once." "Not exactly." Dr. Mitchell leaned forward. "We think you've been cycling between normal space and extended space, with gaps in your memory during the transitions. The extended areas seem to have a hypnotic effect on people who spend too much time in them." Julian tried to process this information, but it felt like trying to solve a puzzle with missing pieces. What happened to the other people? The ones who were living in those rooms? Dr. Mitchell and Colonel Harrison exchanged another look. "We're not sure they ever left," Colonel Harrison said quietly. Julian felt a chill of understanding. The inhabited rooms he'd seen, the personal belongings covered in dust, the sense that people had left suddenly. "They're still in there, aren't they?" Dr. Mitchell nodded. "We believe so. The extended dimensional space has a way of retaining things. People who spend too much time there begin to exist primarily in that space, with only brief returns to normal reality. And that's what's happening to me. The quantum signature suggests you're in the early stages of dimensional displacement. If we don't intervene soon, you may find it increasingly difficult to return to normal space." Julian looked at the bank of security monitors, trying to ground himself in the familiar reality of the security office. But even here, he could feel the wrongness at the edges of his perception. The draft that shouldn't exist, the scent of ozone, the sense that the walls were not quite where they appeared to be. "What do you want me to do?" Colonel Harrison stood up. "Mr. Julian, we need you to help us map the extended dimensional space and locate the missing researchers. You seem to have an unusual ability to navigate the area and return to normal space." "And if I refuse?" Dr. Mitchell's expression was sympathetic but firm. "The dimensional displacement is progressive. Whether you help us or not, you'll eventually be drawn back into the extended space. The only question is whether you'll retain enough connection to normal reality to find your way back." Julian realized he didn't really have a choice. The extended dimensional space had already claimed him. His only option was to help others before he was lost completely. "All right, what do you need me to do?" Colonel Harrison smiled grimly. "Tonight, at 3:17 a.m., we want you to enter the extended space again. But this time, you'll be wearing tracking equipment and carrying instruments that will help us map the area. And if I can't find my way back," Dr. Mitchell's expression was carefully neutral, "we'll monitor your quantum signature from normal space. If you begin to show signs of permanent displacement, we'll attempt an extraction." "Attempt? The technology is experimental. We can't guarantee success." Julian looked at the security monitors again, watching the normal corridors of Harrowfield Research Institute. In a few hours, those familiar spaces would reveal their hidden extensions, and he would enter a reality governed by laws he didn't understand. But he would do it because the alternative was to slowly fade from normal existence anyway. And because somewhere in those impossible rooms, people were waiting for rescue. The 317 protocol wasn't just about containing spatial anomalies. It was about saving the people who had become lost between dimensions, existing in spaces that shouldn't exist, remembering lives they might never fully return to. Julian settled into his chair and waited for night to fall. At 3:17 a.m., he would enter the extended space again. This time, he might not come back.